Alright, another video. Today we're going to be talking about the military-industrial complex. Specifically when it comes to America, how it's utilized within the capitalistic structure. You know, what it looks like, what you've heard of, like Boeing. I've talked about it a little bit. Boeing, Lockheed Martin, General Electric, these sorts of monopolistic sort of businesses. But why are they a negative thing? Why did Dwight D. Eisenhower in the early 50s, after, being a World War II general, actively oppose what was being curated around the 40s? Well, for a couple of things. Starting off, during the Great Depression around the 20s and the 30s, we had some of the worst economic crises in the entire world. Millions and millions of people out of jobs, on the streets, poverty. And there had been attempts, when it came to the Great Deal of FDR, that there would be some sort of improvement, whether or not it was food stamps, housing markets. This would be the implementation of sort of like the welfare state, the government actively giving resources to then build up people in societies. Of course, that would be improved somewhat when it came to the 60s of LBJ's Great Society, and then that would include, more minority groups. That would include more expansion of food stamps. That would include Medicare and Medicaid, or the creation of Medicare and Medicaid. Whereas FDR was mainly for white people, white men in particular, that would utilize that sort of system. Anyways, it wasn't until around the start of World War II, in 1939, that the United States would start improving itself economically. This was through giant creations of manufacturing companies, Henry Ford's assembly process, all the other pre-existing businesses that we had already had. Millions and millions of people would use, very little of their gasoline, or they would carpool a lot. They would take cans or bottles and things like that, hard plastics, or not plastics, sorry, or like, cheap metals and things like that, and give them to the government, and then they would then use that in the military to produce tanks, weapons, artillery, things like this. Now, the United States has used that as kind of a collectivist sort of movement in order to benefit people, benefit the war effort. So then we wouldn't be conquered potentially by Japan or by Spain or by Germany and all these other different fronts that were mobilizing themselves. After the war had ended, we did not really retract our military-industrial complex. It actually grew, and it continued to grow. You can see that through the Iraq War. You can see that through the Persian Gulf War. You can see that with the Afghanistan War. You can see that with the Vietnam War. You can see that with the Korean War. You can see that with, the whole, that includes the Cold War. But a lot of proxy wars, a lot of proxy conflicts and engagements that we had, that the United States had implemented itself so that we could benefit from it through military means. So oil production, petroleum, assassinating certain people in certain countries through the CIA, and then we could, set up market pricing within that country. Institutionalizing our own dictators from, other dictators in other countries. We did that with Iraq, we did it with Iran, we did it with most of the Latin America, we did it with, I don't know, what other examples? Laos, we tried doing it with Vietnam, Cambodia, Nicaragua. Nicaragua was a big one. We've always used the military-industrial complex, and then that's also been carried through, selectivization of cabinet positions from, the chief commander being the president, commander-in-chief. So those are really the people that have most of that sort of specific sort of power. When people talk about the deep state, they usually, in my opinion, it would be those people that control really the means of production insofar as what goes on into our country, whether, because it's supposed to be passed through in Congress, and have a bipartisan rule of, the amount of funding and things like that. For example, you can take the Iranian Contra affair. Ronald Reagan's administration had not received a congressional budget anymore when it came to fighting the war in Nicaragua. So what they had done instead was go and sell weapons to Iran while they were simultaneously having a war with Iraq around the early 80s. It was the early 80s it's like 1980 to 1989 is when, so an entire decade war, basically. Anyways, the Reagan administration had given them weapons, military, weapons, ballistic missiles, things like that, in order to combat Iraq. We then would receive that money. We then would take that money and then go and fight in Nicaragua of the Contras. So it's the Contras and blanking out on the other name, I'm sorry. The Contras is who we were fighting against. We were fighting against a type of communist sort of society that was building up in Nicaragua. Of course, that was a political and an economic strategy as to keep our own free trade, so to speak, our democratic mobilization of territories in order to keep the market prices down, because we wanted to keep our dollar value as high as humanly possible, so then we can keep trading with other nations, and then when we trade with other nations, we then get back most of the profits and things like that, and then we can keep recycling our own, or really their own, resources, and then selling them for cheap. How else can I describe the military-industrial complex? It's really off of profiting off of militarism, off of war. So when it's suitable and convenient for the government to go into another nation, let's go bomb Somalia for the 40th time, or let's go sell weapons to Iran, or let's go sell weapons to Israel, we'll create a whole bunch of conflicts. They'll start attacking each other. They'll worsen their own GDP and their own selves economically. We then produce troops. We produce, whatever we need to, other ballistic missiles, other defense systems. We'll send fleets of carriers to then go extract whatever resources we need. And then we'll dip. And we'll go back to our country. We'll reap the benefits of low gasoline prices. And then once we have those low gasoline prices, then it's cheaper labor. It's cheaper consumerism. The trucks, like what JD Vance talks about, which is true, is that if the pricing of gasoline for these trucks and then producing, sending whatever resources is in these trucks to, you know, pharmaceutical companies or whatever sort of like institutions through cargo, then it will be cheaper since the usage of that gasoline was cheaper. So that has been one of the, if not the strategy that the United States has used since really around the 40s. And then you could even argue beforehand, but that's really when the United States military had fully mobilized itself and became a national threat, especially after Hiroshima and Nagasaki. You know, the entire world was sort of threatened by us, even though we, of course, had used Nazis in order to accelerate the rate of development of these nuclear weapons. And of course, that was to, you know, defeat the Russians and in hope that they wouldn't turn on us and things like that. How this applies now is you can see it through our military budget. Our military budget has steadily increased since that time. And we spend more money on the military budget than any other country in the entire world, and that is, of course, to inadvertently or overtly show our dominance through our military might. You know, we have the strongest Navy in the world. We have one of the strongest air forces in the world, and we utilize that to our advantage. We have eyes everywhere in all countries all the time, and we systematically use other people's resources in order to benefit our country. We owe billions, trillions of dollars to other countries, like in China, Japan, France, Britain, even though, you know, they owe us in a sense of NATO protection, which is another reason why we had even created NATO in the first place, is not just for European coherence and allegiance to us, you know, in the hope that there won't be another nuclear war or another nuclear holocaust, but really to improve our markets. It was an economic strategy. Most of the things that the United States does is specifically an economic strategy. If we can keep the means of production through military mobilization of Boeing and of Lockheed Martin and General Electric, then to us we control and dominate most of the world. That's why when it comes to like STEM field researches, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, we have those be research assistants, military assistants. We have them, you know, go into Boeing, go into Lockheed Martin, go into General Electric. That's why we promote so much trade. We love trade schools. Because if we don't have these sorts of people with these sorts of skills to mass produce these types of weapons of mass destruction, then other countries will beat us. We have influenced this. Other countries, of course, have influenced this. But to us now, it seems that the United States has no choice. Of course, it does have a choice, but to us, it seems like we have no choice other than to keep producing this military-industrial complex in order to not die. Because if we stop the military-industrial complex, if we try to find other avenues and ways in order to produce just as many resources or more resources, we will ultimately fail, because we don't know how to. We don't know how to produce resources and goods on our own. We haven't been able to produce resources and goods on our own since the 40s, and even before then. When it came to Detroit steel, we don't have as good of steel anymore. We don't have as much oil and fuel production as we do anymore. We don't have timber as much as we do anymore. We don't have these abundant resources like we used to anymore. We get our cobalt from the Congo. We get our timber from Canada. We get our wineries from France and Italy and Britain. We get our fuel production from China. We get all of these things from other countries, utilize this, and try to reproduce all of these things and give back these materials at a higher price to other countries and fuck them over. Of course, they try to fuck us over as well. That is just the creation of the market system in and of itself. It's just what we do market-wise. Trump is, of course, doing this. He's increasing the military-industrial complex. He went, I think it was a couple weeks ago by now, of talking with Boeing, talking with General Electric, and then increasing the budget for the defense system to, I believe, $1 trillion, probably a little bit over than that, and then it will, of course, keep increasing. The military-industrial complex is an imperialist idea. It is a colonialist idea. We have utilized this when it comes to Cuba, when it comes to the Philippines, when it comes to Guam, Hawaii, these sorts of provinces that we used to have and still do. We go through their freights, we go through their, shipping yards. We provide it at a price that they can't have. We force these people to be then indebted into us. We lower their GDP value. They still produce, say the exact same amount of oil. It's still awful oil. It's not very good. It's not very refined. We'll take that oil. We'll then use it within our own refineries. Still cheaper, still more efficient. And then these other countries, destroy themselves, or then get taken out by other countries, or go to war with other countries. That's why so many countries hate us, why we have so many enemies. And then we perpetuate this by then saying, well, then there's these other countries who hate us, and we have to go to war. We need to fight. That is because it is usually provoked by us. Maybe not always. There are some genuine threats in American society, but when it comes down to it, most of the time, the United States is the perpetuation and the perpetrator of the world. We are the world dominating power of the identification of military-industrial complex. That is what the United States is, at least, especially since the 40s, rather than it being the common man working, 70, 80 hours a week in order to provide for his family on a, little farm or things. Then it mobilizes itself as a white picket fence, and then the man going to the job site, or the woman staying at home with the babies, and the TV dinners, and the white picket fences, and the white children, and that sort of specific idea. And then we'll provide ourselves and indulge ourselves in consumer sort of ideas, whether it's TV, video games, movies, internet, social media platforms, convenience appliances. And the way that we develop these conveniences and appliances is usually through warmongering and other capitalistic exploitations in order to make a specific few set of people, or maybe even the majority of people, seem to be comforted but still lacking a sense of purpose. And often we don't provide ourselves with really any sort of sense of purpose. And we can't feel any sort of sense of purpose when we can just see other countries being eradicated off the face of the earth because the United States is ultimately, maybe not ultimately, but in some regards, responsible for the perpetuation of this. I mean, the war with Israel and Iran right now, we've continuously sided both sides. We've sided with Iran for decades. We've sided with Israel for decades. Ultimately, our allegiance will be to Israel in some regard. But we've also dibbled when it came to Iran, with Joe Biden's administration, or with Obama's administration, or with Donald Trump's administration, Ronald Reagan's administration, all these other administrations, we've continuously given billions and billions of dollars to Iran to eventually develop these nuclear weapons of mass destruction, like they've been saying. This is a similar talking point with what happened with George Bush and Dick Cheney. Dick Cheney or George Bush said that there are weapons of mass destruction in Iraq and we need to go invade Iraq. Then once we get there, we kidnap and take hostage of Saddam Hussein, and we find that there are no weapons of mass destruction, that there were hints of it, or the picture that they had taken of the weapons of mass destruction were just eventual developments of weapons of mass destruction that would eventually have taken another 20 additional years for them to have even developed this. But with that being said, what are ways that we can combat this? Sadly, we have to, in some regard, let the system fall a little bit. But also, if we do let the system fall, then other countries will attack us. The United States is at a crossing point right now, crossroad of whether or not we double down in the military-industrial complex, because if we do double down in the military-industrial complex, then we have to be the oppressor, the empire, rather than being the pacifist and the isolationists that we were in the first two world wars. We will directly have influenced and shown our teeth in, if there is the possibility of World War III. Or we back out of it. We back out of it, and then other countries will, take the pickings of what will be left of the United States, because we've had over 70 or 80 years of offshore markets rather than domestic made production of goods, because we don't know how to do it anymore. And I think Trump is also realizing that, and these tariffs of course won't help. These tariffs are directly affecting the consumer, but he's doing multiple things at once in order to prop up the military-industrial complex. He's trying to prop up the military-industrial complex by exploiting foreign goods, but also by forcing other countries to then only buy things specifically from the United States or produce things specifically in the United States. Because it won't make the United States, it'll make the United States richer, it'll make the GDP value go higher, it'll make us have the most prosperous nation and society, but it won't be for the majority of the United States people. It will be for a select few who will have all of the money, just like an oligarch, just like an autocratic dictator. It will be the exact same thing. So the United States, as far as I can see it, has two choices. You either double down on the military-industrial complex and become a full-blown dictator and authoritarian, potentially totalitarian state, and imperialize and mobilize just like Japan, just like Germany, just like Stalinist Russia, just like Spain. Or you succumb to your guilt and to your shame, and you back out militarily, and then that will then reduce militarism in some regard, and then other countries will then take over the United States. Either way, I do think that the United States will unfortunately pay in some regard to the years and years of warmongering and dictatorship that it has produced. Just like when it came to Britain, just like when it came down to Germany or Italy or Spain, Czechoslovakia or Poland, that were ultimately conquered. It would be the exact same thing. The colonialist past of other nations always suffer eventually. And I think it is soon for the United States to suffer. Overall, the military-industrial complex is a oppressive, systematic way in order to lobby money through corporations and government. That's usually what they do, is they mobilize the corporations of Lockheed Martin or General Electric or Boeing, then fuse it with the government in the budgeting of the Department of Defense, and then other departments, of course, and typically, maybe if they're influenced by Congress or sorts of things, or then they also use the CIA and the FBI, and then they send enforcements over to other countries. They then will exploit them and extract them for certain resources and then come back. That is, in its core, at least also in my belief, what the military-industrial complex is. But, yeah. Alright, hope you guys enjoyed the video. I'll make one soon. I'm not sure exactly what it will be. Might talk about maybe a couple of philosophers or something like that, or sort of like key concepts and ideas. So I could talk about like the Unabomber, John Kaczynski. I have a lot of books, so I could really get into whoever. Leave any suggestions in the comments if you want to see specific philosophers or other specific political ideological systems. And yeah, I'll catch you guys in the next video. All right, peace.